The morning Delia Hale drove a nail into the old pine door of the First Methodist Church of Caldwell, Kansas. Her hands were shaking so badly that she missed twice and struck her own thumb, but she did not cry. She had run clean out of tears 2 weeks before, the same day she buried her husband and discovered he had left her nothing but debt. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell sat just north of the Cherokee Strip like a town that could not quite decide whether it wanted to be civilized or savage. The cattle drive still rolled through in great bellowing rivers of longhorns, and the saloons did more business than the church most days of the week, and the dust came in off the prairie so thick some mornings that a woman could taste the whole of the Kansas plain on her tongue before she ever sat down to breakfast. Delia had lived in Caldwell for 6 years, long enough to know its rhythms and its faults, and the particular way dishonest men smiled when they wanted something from you. She was 28 years old, dark-haired, with brown eyes that had gone a little harder than nature intended, and she stood 5 feet and 4 inches in boots that were beginning to separate at the left sole. She had married Thomas Hale at 22 because he had seemed steady, and steady had seemed like the most romantic quality a man could possess when you had grown up watching your father gamble away 3 different farms in 2 different states. Thomas had been steady for about 4 years, and then something in him had shifted, some quiet loosening of character that she had not noticed until it was already too late, and by the time he died of a fever that should not have killed a man his age, she was left with a farmstead 12 miles east of town, a mortgage she could not meet, a mule named Ezra who was ornery on the best of days, and the growing suspicion that every man in Sumner County either wanted to cheat her or acquire her property for pennies on the dollar, and several of them wanted to do both. The note she pinned to the church door that morning was short. She had written it by lamplight at the kitchen table, rewriting it 4 times on paper she could not easily afford to waste, and the final version said this: I am Delia Hale of the Hale Farm on the Chicaskia Road. I am in need of one honest man, not a rich man, not a powerful one, only an honest one to help me examine the contract that Abel Marsh is pressing me to sign regarding my land. I cannot pay wages. I can offer honest work in return. If you are a man of your word, I ask you to come to my farm by Saturday. If no honest man exists in this town, then I will know that too, and I will act accordingly. She did not sign it with anything softer than her name. She had considered adding a please, and then she had decided that please was the kind of word that told men they had the upper hand, and she had given enough men the upper hand already. She stepped back from the church door and looked at the note for a long moment. The morning light was thin and pale, and the street behind her was not yet fully awake, just a dog crossing between 2 buildings and the distant sound of someone splitting wood. She had told no one she was going to do this. Her neighbor Cora Finch would have told her it was undignified. The Reverend would have offered her prayer and possibly a casserole. Neither of those things would stop Abel Marsh from foreclosing. She climbed back up onto the buckboard, spoke firmly to Ezra, who expressed his feelings about the early hour in the usual way by refusing to move for 30 seconds before eventually deciding to cooperate, and she drove back out of town with the feeling that she had either done something very brave or something very foolish, and she was not entirely sure which. The week that followed was not gentle to her. She had supplies to account for, and a south field that needed tending, and a leaking roof over the back bedroom that she had been patching with salvaged tin and pure stubbornness for the better part of 3 months. She worked from sunup to past dark, and she thought about the note every single day the way a person thinks about a letter they have mailed and cannot take back. She wondered who had read it. She wondered if anyone had laughed. She wondered if Abel Marsh himself had seen it, and whether it had made him angry or merely amused, and both possibilities unsettled her. Abel Marsh was not a man who inspired neutrality. He was the largest landowner in the eastern section of Sumner County, a wide, red-faced man of 52 who wore good boots and worse intentions, and who had been circling the Hale property since before Thomas was even in the ground. Thomas had borrowed money from Marsh 2 years before he died, money that Delia had not known about until Marsh showed up at the farm with documents she had never seen and a smile that did not reach his eyes, and told her in a tone that managed to be simultaneously sympathetic and threatening that the loan was due in full within 90 days, or she would need to sign over the eastern 40 acres as settlement. The eastern 40 acres were the best land on the property, the land closest to the creek, the land that made the rest of it viable. Without the eastern 40, the farm was not really a farm at all. It was just a house slowly losing its argument with the elements. She had gone to 3 men in town before she wrote the note. The first was the lawyer, a man named Geddes who smelled of tobacco and seemed genuinely confused by the idea that a widow might question a contract. He told her the documents looked legitimate to him and charged her $2 for the opinion. The second was the banker, Hollister, who suggested very kindly that she consider selling the whole property and moving somewhere more suitable to a woman alone, which was a sentence she had not yet fully forgiven him for. The third was Sheriff Dennett, who was a decent enough man but who owed Marsh 3 favors of the financial variety and who told her, without quite meeting her eyes, that civil disputes were outside his particular jurisdiction. So she had written the note, and she had pinned it to the church door. And now Saturday was 2 days away, and she was beginning to prepare herself for the distinct possibility that no one would come, because Caldwell in 1878 was a town that knew which side of the bread the butter was on, and Abel Marsh was a man who owned a great deal of butter. On Friday evening, she baked a pan of cornbread she could not really afford to make and set it on the table like a kind of preparation, an act of faith in the possibility of company, and then she sat by the window with her mending and watched the road go dark and told herself she was not waiting. She was absolutely waiting. Saturday morning she was up before the rooster had entirely committed to the idea, and she had the coffee on and the cornbread wrapped in a cloth and the table wiped down twice before 7 o'clock. By 9 o'clock she had convinced herself no one was coming. By 10 o'clock she had talked herself out of crying about it. By 10:30 she was in the south field with a hoe, attacking the soil with a focus that was entirely disproportionate to the weeding task at hand. She heard the horse before she saw the man. It came at a deliberate walk up the Chicaskia Road, a solid bay gelding with good legs and a calm manner, and the man on it was not what she had expected, though she could not have said afterward what exactly she had expected. He was perhaps 30 or 31, lean in the way that outdoor work made a man lean, with a jaw that had not been introduced to a razor in several days, and dark brown hair that was just long enough to curl slightly at the back of his neck, where it met his collar. He wore a plain gray shirt and a worn canvas coat and working trousers, and his hat was a practical brown thing with no ornamentation whatsoever. He had a rifle in the saddle scabbard, which was simply how men traveled in this part of Kansas, and a bedroll tied behind, and the overall impression he gave was of a man who had somewhere to be but was in no particular rush about getting there. He stopped his horse at the fence line and looked at her across it. "You are Delia Hale," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said, and she kept the hoe in her hand because she was not in the habit of disarming herself when strange men arrived at her property. "I saw your note," he said. She studied him from across the fence. "You and possibly 40 other people." "Maybe," he said, "but I am the one who rode out." She could not immediately argue with that. "Who are you?" she asked. "Harlan Warren," he said. "I came into Caldwell 3 days ago looking for seasonal work. I am not from here. I do not know Abel Marsh, have no particular interest in his good opinion, and I can read a legal contract well enough to know when one is crooked." He paused. "If that is what you need." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his face that she was trying to read the way you read weather, looking for the hidden thing beneath the surface presentation. She had grown good at reading men for dishonesty, good enough that it had begun to feel like a kind of exhaustion, the constant vigilance of it. But this man's face was, she searched for the word and settled on direct. It was a direct face, nothing elaborate in it. "You said you can read contracts," she said. "Where did you learn that?" "My father was a circuit judge in Missouri," he said. "Before the war took him, I read a great many legal documents as a boy, never became a lawyer myself. Turned out I liked the out-of-doors too much." He paused again. "I am not offering you anything I cannot deliver, Mrs. Hale. I am saying I will look at your documents and tell you what I honestly see. I will not exaggerate what I know or pretend to expertise I do not have." "That is a remarkably modest sales pitch," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "You asked for an honest man, not a persuasive one." She almost smiled. She caught herself, but not quite fast enough, and she thought he noticed. She walked to the gate and opened it and said, "Put your horse in the small corral. There is water in the trough. I have coffee on and cornbread, and the documents are inside." He swung down from the horse with the easy movement of a man who had spent most of his life climbing on and off horses, and he led the gelding through the gate with a quiet courtesy that she noticed. The way he stepped to the side so she could close the gate without having to reach around him. Small thing. She noticed it anyway. His name, she learned over the next hour, was Harlan James Warren, and he had grown up in a small town outside of Independence, Missouri, which put him just far enough from the Kansas-Missouri border wars to have been aware of them without being consumed by them. He was 30 years old, which she confirmed by asking directly, because she had decided at some point in the previous year that indirectness was a luxury she could no longer afford. He had spent the years since the war working his way westward in the general pattern of a man who was looking for something, without being entirely sure what it was: cattle work in Texas, freighting work in Colorado, a year on a horse ranch in New Mexico that he spoke about with a particular warmth that told her it had been a good year. And now here, drifted north along the cattle trails, looking for seasonal work on one of the farms or ranches that always needed hands in the planting months. He read through Abel Marsh's documents with a careful, unhurried attention that she found herself watching from across the table. He had taken off his hat, and there was a line across his forehead where it had sat, which was such a characteristic mark of a working man in this country that she felt oddly comforted by it. He did not speak for 15 minutes, and he did not rush, and when he finished reading the first document he went back and read it again, and she did not interrupt because she appreciated that he was treating it seriously. "This clause here," he said at last, and he turned the paper around and set it on the table facing her, pointing with one finger at a paragraph near the bottom. "Do you see where it says, 'and all appurtenant parcels thereto'?" She looked. "Yes. That language, if I am reading this correctly, means that what Marsh is asking you to sign over is not just the 40 acres on the east side of your property." He sat back slightly. "It is the 40 acres and anything legally attached to it. Now the deed to your property, do you have that?" She brought it to him. He laid it beside the Marsh document and compared them, and she watched his jaw tighten slightly at something he found. "The water rights to the creek run through the deed as attached to the eastern parcel," he said. "So if you sign Marsh's document, you are signing away the water rights for the whole property. Without the creek access, the western portion of your land cannot support farming or grazing in any dry year, and Kansas has dry years with considerable regularity." He looked up at her. "Did Marsh's man explain this to you?" "Marsh's man explained to me that this was a straightforward settlement of a legitimate debt, and that I was lucky to keep any land at all," she said. Harlan was quiet for a moment. "That is not an honest characterization of what this document does," he said, and there was something in the evenness of his voice that was somehow more damning than anger would have been. "No," she agreed. "It is not." He turned the document over slowly. "The original loan document, may I see that?" She had it in the same cedar box where she kept everything important, and she brought it to him, and he read it with the same careful attention, and this time she saw something change in his expression, a slight narrowing of the eyes. "What is the date Thomas signed this?" he asked. "March of 1876, she said. "And you said he passed in February of this year." "So the loan was for 2 years," Harlan said, "and the due date written here is March of 1878. He looked at her, "which is next month." "Yes, but Marsh's representative came to you when?" "3 weeks ago, the last week of February." He was quiet for a moment. "The loan is not yet due," he said. She stared at him. "What?" "The due date written in this document is March 15th, 1878, he said, and he turned it so she could read the date herself, which she did, leaning over the table, her finger tracing the numbers. "Marsh's man came to you early, possibly expecting you would not notice the date or would not have someone to point it out to you. If you have not yet signed his settlement agreement, the debt is technically not yet in default." She straightened slowly and sat back in her chair. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Outside, Ezra made some complaint from the direction of the small corral. "I have not signed it," she said. "Good. I was going to sign it this coming week," she said. "I thought I had no choice." "You have some choices," he said carefully. "I would not overstate your position. The debt is real, the document is real, and when March 15th arrives you will still owe Marsh what Thomas borrowed. But you have time, and the document he wants you to sign it is not written to your benefit. There may be grounds to negotiate different terms." He paused. "I would also say that this appurtenant clause is unusual. Most legitimate settlement agreements don't include language that expansive. It looks like it was written to take more than the debt covers." She looked at the papers on her table, and then she looked at Harlan Warren's honest, tired, weathered face, and she felt something give way inside her chest, some braced thing that she had been holding shut with both hands for the better part of 2 months, and she pressed her lips together hard and looked at the window for a moment until she was sure of herself. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was level. "I mean that sincerely." "You do not need to thank me," he said, and then, after a brief pause, "Actually, that is not true. I would be glad of your thanks, and I wonder if I might trouble you for another piece of that cornbread." She laughed. It was not a polite laugh or a social laugh. It was a real one, and it surprised her, and apparently it surprised him too, because he looked at her with a slight widening of the eyes, and then smiled, a slow, genuine smile that changed his whole face and made her look at him differently than she had been looking at him. She cut him another piece of cornbread. He did not leave that day. This was not by design on anyone's part. At least that was what she told herself. But the examination of the documents led naturally to a conversation about her options, which led to a conversation about the property itself, which led to her walking him around the perimeter of the farm in the late afternoon light to show him where the creek ran, and where the fence line was, and what the eastern 40 looked like. And by the time they had completed the circuit, the sun was sitting low and red in the west, and it was too late to make the ride back to Caldwell before dark without some risk of trouble. She showed him where the small barn was, and told him he was welcome to sleep there if he was willing to share the space with Ezra and 2 chickens who had taken up residence in a corner despite her repeated attempts to relocate them. And he said that was fine, that he had slept in worse company. She lay awake that night longer than she meant to, looking at the ceiling of her bedroom and thinking about March 15th and Abel Marsh and water rights, and also, at intervals she could not entirely control, about the way Harlan Warren had looked at her when she laughed, like it was something he wanted to see again. She told herself firmly that she had larger concerns. She was right about this. She was also aware that being right about it did not make it less true. In the morning she found him already up, having fed Ezra and the 2 rebellious chickens, and started a small fire in the yard to boil water, and he had a battered tin coffee pot that he had produced from his saddlebag, and he offered her coffee from it without any fuss, and she accepted it, and they stood in the early morning yard together in the particular comfortable silence that she had not shared with anyone in a long time. "I have been thinking," he said after a while. About the documents. About the documents and about your situation more generally, he said. Marsh has more money than you and more influence in the county, and those are real disadvantages, but you have something he may not have counted on. What is that? You have time, and you have the actual legal language on your side, at least regarding the settlement agreement. If you had a lawyer willing to look at this carefully, a different lawyer than Geddes, who I understand is not exactly a model of independence. Is there a different lawyer? She asked. There is a man named Coates in Wellington, he said. I heard him mentioned in Caldwell as someone who takes cases Geddes won't. Wellington is a day's ride. She was quiet, calculating. Wellington was the county seat further east, a bigger town. She had been there twice. I cannot leave the farm for a day, she said. There is no one to I could stay, he said. It came out simply, without elaboration, and he looked at her steadily when he said it. She looked at him over her coffee cup. You said you were looking for seasonal work, she said. I was, he said. I am. I told you in the note that I cannot pay wages. I know what the note said, he said. I read it. Then I do not understand, she said, though she said it carefully, not ungratefully. What I mean, he said, and now there was something slightly less steady in his voice, something that sounded like a man choosing his words with more than usual care, is that I have no particular place I need to be this week that is more important than this. And the fence on your south field needs mending. I noticed it when we walked yesterday. And there is a section of your roof that needs more than salvaged tin before the spring rains come. These are things I can do while you go to Wellington, if you are willing to let me. She studied him for a long moment. She had spent the better part of 6 months developing a thorough, and she felt justified distrust of the offers of assistance that men made to women alone, because, in her experience, such offers generally turned out to have prices attached that were not disclosed up front. But Harlan Warren had ridden 12 miles on a Saturday morning in response to a note on a church door asking for nothing more and nothing less than honesty, and in 1 hour at her kitchen table, he had found what 3 other men in the county had either missed or deliberately overlooked, and he had told her about it without softening it or using it to make himself seem indispensable. All right, she said. I will go to Wellington on Monday. He nodded and looked back out over the field and drank his coffee. She rode to Wellington on Monday with the documents in a leather satchel that had been Thomas's, and she found the lawyer named Coates in a small office above the dry goods store, a thin, bespectacled man of about 50 who smelled of pipe tobacco and old books, and who turned out to be, improbably, exactly what she needed. He read the Marsh documents with the focused attention of a man who had seen this kind of thing before, and he confirmed everything Harlan had told her, and added several details she had not known, including the fact that there was a territorial court ruling from 1876 regarding water rights language in Sumner County property transactions that Marsh's clause may have directly violated. She rode back on Tuesday with a letter from Coates to Marsh's attorney and a plan, and she arrived home in the late afternoon to find the south fence repaired so cleanly it might have been new, and a section of the roof over the back bedroom patched with proper lumber rather than salvaged tin, and Harlan sitting on the porch step sharpening a knife, and Ezra in the small corral looking, she thought, slightly less aggrieved than usual, which she attributed to either the new fence or the company. How did it go? Harlan asked. She sat down on the step beside him, still in her riding clothes, too tired to stand any longer, and she told him everything Coates had said, and he listened without interrupting, and when she was done he said, "That is better than I hoped." "Better than I hoped too," she said. They were close together on the narrow step, and she was aware of it in a way that was not uncomfortable, only present, the way you are aware of warmth from a fire without moving toward or away from it. "You fixed the fence," she said, "and the roof," he said. "I noticed." She paused. "Thank you, Harlan." He was quiet for a moment. "You keep thanking me," he said. "You do not need to." "I will decide what I need to do," she said, mildly but with intent, and he looked at her sideways and she saw that smile again, the slow one. He stayed another week. He told her he would help her through whatever came next with Marsh, and she told him she would not hold him to that if something better came along, and he said nothing had any intention of coming along, and she decided not to press the question because she was finding that she did not want him to go, and she was not yet ready to examine that feeling too closely. The letter from Coates reached Marsh's attorney, a man named Priestley who operated out of an office in Caldwell, on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, Marsh himself had come out to the farm. She was in the yard when his carriage came up the road, a good black carriage with brass fittings that was not at all suited to the unpaved Chicaskia road and suffered visibly for it, and she stood and watched it come with her arms folded and her chin level. Harlan was mending a section of board fence near the barn when the carriage arrived, and he straightened and set down his tools and came to stand about 20 feet behind her, which was exactly the right distance, close enough to be present but far enough not to crowd her, and she registered it without looking at him. Abel Marsh climbed down from his carriage with the deliberate care of a heavy man and regarded her across the yard with the expression of a man who has been surprised and does not enjoy the sensation. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I was not aware you had retained counsel." "There are a number of things about me that seem to have caught you unaware, Mr. Marsh," she said. He glanced at Harlan. His eyes did the calculation that men's eyes did, assessing, measuring. "Who is this?" "That is my business," she said. Marsh returned his gaze to her. "Mrs. Hale, I want to be clear that I have extended considerable patience in this matter, Mr. Marsh," she said. "My attorney has written to your attorney, and I believe the content of that letter speaks for itself. The loan on my property is not yet due. The settlement agreement your representative presented to me contains language that goes substantially beyond what the original loan agreement covers, specifically regarding water rights. My attorney is prepared to file for a review of the settlement terms in county court if we cannot reach an agreement that accurately reflects the actual debt and nothing more." She paused. "I am willing to negotiate in good faith. I am not willing to sign a document that takes more than what is owed." The silence in the yard was considerable. Somewhere behind her she could hear Ezra moving in the corral and one of the chickens making its private commentary. Marsh looked at her for a long moment with the look of a man reassessing his position. "You have had advice," he said. "I have," she said. "I suggest you have your attorney review the water rights language before we discuss further." Marsh looked again at Harlan, who was standing with his hands loose at his sides and the mild, watchful expression of a man who is paying attention without advertising it. "We will be in touch," Marsh said at last, and he climbed back into his carriage with rather less dignity than he had descended with, and the carriage turned in the yard and went back down the road, and Delia let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for some time. "You did that very well," Harlan said, coming forward. "My knees are shaking," she said. "That does not mean you did not do it well," he said. She turned to look at him and found him closer than she expected, and there was something in his face that was different than his usual expression, something warmer and more open, and she was suddenly very aware that she had been living alongside this man for the better part of a week, and that she had begun to know certain things about him. That he was up before dawn every morning, and that he preferred his coffee strong, and that he talked to her mule with the patient, reasonable tone of someone who believed Ezra was capable of understanding the argument and simply chose not to, and that he laughed quietly rather than loudly, and that he never spoke about himself unless she asked directly, and that when she did ask directly he answered without pretense or performance. She was aware that she was looking at him for slightly too long, and she looked away, back at the road where Marsh's carriage was dwindling. "I am going to make supper," she said. "I will wash up," he said. Supper that night was a quieter thing, but not an uncomfortable quiet, more the quiet of two people who have passed through something difficult together and find themselves on the other side of it, not quite sure what the ground looks like now. She made a proper pot of beans with salt pork and the last of the onions from the root cellar, and there was bread she had made that morning, and they sat at the table in the lamplight and ate together, and it felt, in a way she was not quite able to dismiss, like something she might want to keep doing. "Tell me about the horse ranch in New Mexico," she said, because she was curious and because she had decided that directness suited her. He looked up from his bowl, a little surprised by the question, and then he settled into it and told her about the San Juan Valley, about a ranch run by a man named Ortega and his 2 sons, and the particular way the mountains looked in the winter, white above brown, and the way the horses moved in the valley fields in the morning. He spoke about it with such evident warmth that she found herself leaning forward slightly, elbows on the table, listening. "Why did you leave?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Ortega sold the ranch," he said. "He was getting old. His sons had gone elsewhere. He sold to a land company from Denver." A pause. "I did not want to work for a land company." "So you drifted north," she said. "I drifted north," he confirmed. He looked at her across the table. "You have been here 6 years. 6 years. Do you like it here?" he asked, and the question had a simplicity to it that invited a real answer. She thought about it. "I like the land," she said. "I like this particular land, these fields and the creek and the way the sky looks at the end of the day. I did not like some of the things that happened on it." She paused. "I want to keep it." "That is different from liking it, perhaps, but I think they are becoming the same thing." He nodded slowly. "I understand that," he said, "wanting to keep something." She looked at him carefully. "Do you?" She said, "You have been moving for how long?" 8 years since the war," he said. "That is a long time to be moving." "Yes," he said, and there was something in the word that was neither proud nor entirely easy with itself. She did not push further. She stacked the bowls and he carried them to the washstand without being asked, and she washed them and he dried them with a cloth, standing beside her in the small kitchen, and the domesticity of it was so ordinary and so startling at once that she kept her eyes on the bowls and was careful to be very thorough about the washing. 2 weeks passed. Marsh's attorney communicated through Coates, and the terms shifted. The water rights language was removed. The settlement was renegotiated, and by the end of March Delia had signed a document that committed her to paying back the actual amount of the loan, the principal with interest, over a period of 18 months, with the eastern 40 acres as security but not as an automatic forfeit, and with the water rights entirely untouched. It was not a triumphant outcome in the sense that she still had debt, and she still had 18 months of very careful financial management ahead of her, but it was a fair outcome, and fair was more than she had dared to hope for in February. She told Harlan over supper the evening Coates sent confirmation, and he looked at her across the table with that quiet smile and said, "Good," and she said, "It would not have happened without you." And he started to object, and she stopped him with a look that she had been practicing for years on men who objected to the obvious. "I know you want to say it was all me," she said. "It was not all me. I am not too proud to know that." He was quiet for a moment. "You did the hard parts," he said. "We will disagree on that," she said pleasantly. He had been at the farm for 3 weeks by then. He had repaired more than just the fence and the roof. He had fixed the hinge on the barn door that had been dragging for 2 years, and sorted out a problem with the irrigation ditch that fed the kitchen garden, and spent the better part of a day reinforcing the well frame, which had been developing a worrying lean. He had done these things with the same unremarkable steadiness that he did everything, not announcing them or waiting for acknowledgement, simply seeing what needed doing and doing it. She had started to count on seeing him in the mornings, and felt the counting as both a pleasure and a warning. On a warm Thursday in early April, a day that smelled of new grass and the particular clean smell of Kansas after rain, she was in the kitchen garden and he was coming from the direction of the barn, and they met at the garden gate the way two people meet when they have been quietly angling toward each other without admitting it, and he stopped and she stopped, and the morning was very bright around them. "Harlan," she said. She had not planned to say anything. She had planned to continue tending the kitchen garden in a responsible and focused manner. "Yes," he said. "What are you planning to do after this?" she asked. He looked at her. "After what?" "After here," she said. You came for seasonal work and you have not been doing seasonal work exactly. You have been helping me, and the land dispute is settled or mostly settled and she stopped. She started again. I am not asking you to leave. I want to be clear about that. I am asking what you are planning because I have found that I would like to know. He was quiet for a moment, and the morning was doing what spring mornings in Kansas did, all wide light and wind, and the sound of the creek was just audible from where they stood. I have not made plans, he said slowly. I told myself I was drifting, looking for something, and that was true for a long time. I am less sure it is still true. He paused. I am more sure of where I am right now than I have been of anywhere in a considerable while. She looked at him steadily. That is not entirely clear, she said. No, he agreed. I know. He looked at her with the same directness she had been noticing since the first day, that quality of simply looking at the thing rather than around it. What I mean, Delia, is that I do not particularly want to leave. And I am not saying that because you have a farm that needs hands, or because I have nowhere better to go. I am saying it because of you. Because I have not known anyone quite like you in a long time, and I am not anxious to go back to not knowing you. The garden was very quiet between them. A robin somewhere in the cottonwood tree by the fence was making its insistent spring argument. I have a great deal of debt, she said. I know. And I am not an easy person, she said. I have been told that I am difficult and that I am stubborn and that I have very strong opinions about how things should be done. I noticed those things, he said. I noticed them and I found that they suited me considerably. A pause. I am not what you would call smooth or elegant in my own right. I have been moving for 8 years and I have a tendency to understate things and I have no money to speak of and no property of my own. You are honest, she said. I am, he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment, and she was aware that her heart was doing something that she had not invited it to do, but that was happening regardless of her opinion on the matter. And she thought about the note she had pinned to the church door and what she had asked for. One honest man, just one, and how she had thought of it as the most modest possible request, the bare minimum, the thing so basic that surely it could not be asking too much, and yet how hard it had proven to find. I would like you to stay, she said, if you are willing to work the farm with me, properly, as a genuine arrangement. I cannot offer you wages yet, but I can offer you a share of whatever the farm produces and a roof and honest dealing, and I can offer you. She stopped and looked at the ground for a moment and then back at him. I can offer you whatever this is between us and see where it goes. He looked at her with an expression that she could not entirely decode, but that made something warm move through her chest. That is the best offer I have had in 8 years, he said. It is not a particularly competitive field, she said, but she was smiling when she said it, and he was smiling back, and the robin was still making its case in the cottonwood, and the April morning was embarrassingly beautiful about the whole thing. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and his hand was warm and work-roughened and entirely steady, and she held it and they stood there in the kitchen garden gate for a while, and it was not romantic in any of the ways the novels she had read as a girl had described romance. There was no dramatic declaration or sweeping gesture. It was just two people in the morning light holding onto each other, and it felt more real than anything she had experienced in a long time. The weeks that followed had their share of difficulty, because life in Kansas in 1878 did not pause to accommodate the development of new feelings, and there was the farm to run and the debt to manage, and the late spring that kept threatening to turn wet and ruin the early planting. But there was also something new in the fabric of those days, a change in the quality of the ordinary. The way the mornings felt different when there was someone to share the coffee with. The way problems seemed marginally more manageable when you could think out loud to another person who was paying attention and thinking with you rather than around you. He worked the farm with her the way a man works when he is working for himself, not just doing what is asked, but noticing what else needs doing, bringing his own judgment to bear on the problems of soil and weather and timing that made up the constant background noise of a farming life. She found that she trusted his judgment, which was not a thing she had given quickly to any person in recent memory, and that he trusted hers, which was something she had found even rarer, a man who did not need to correct her assessment of a situation before he could engage with it. They had their disagreements, too. She wanted to plant the near field in corn, all the way to the fence line. He thought leaving a strip along the fence for a kitchen garden expansion made better long-term sense for their food supply. And they argued it out over 2 evenings at the kitchen table, with the thoroughness of 2 people who both had opinions and could not be talked past them. And eventually she conceded the kitchen garden point because his reasoning was sound, and he conceded to her on the particular variety of corn seed she preferred, because she had been farming this specific soil longer and she knew it. What she noticed, and what she would have said if anyone had asked her, was that the arguments did not leave damage behind them. They disagreed and they came through it, and they were not worse for it. And that was something she had not known to identify as rare until she had known its opposite. Cora Finch came by in late April with a pie and a transparent interest in the situation, and she looked at Harlan with the evaluating eye of a neighbor who has lived near a person long enough to feel entitled to opinions about their choices, and she pulled Delia aside in the kitchen while Harlan was outside and said, "He is handsome enough, and I grant you that he seems decent, but Delia, you know almost nothing about him." "I know what matters," Delia said. "Such as?" "He is honest," she said. "He is careful. He does not exaggerate what he knows, and he does not minimize what he sees. He treats my opinion as though it counts for something. He got up at 4 in the morning last week because the roof was leaking in the rain, and he did not wake me to tell me about it. He just fixed it." She paused. "I have known men my whole life, Cora, and I can tell you that those qualities are less common than they ought to be." Cora looked at her for a moment. "You are happy," she said, sounding slightly surprised by her own observation. "I am working very hard, and I am in debt, and I am exhausted most evenings by 8:30, Delia said. "But yes, I am happy." Cora took a piece of her own pie home with her and left the rest, and Delia went back outside to where Harlan was coaxing Ezra into cooperation regarding a harness adjustment, and she stood in the yard and watched him and thought, without quite meaning to, that this was how things were supposed to feel when they were right. May came in warm and promising, and the planting went well, better than the previous 2 years, partly because the weather was cooperative and partly because there were 2 people attending to it rather than 1. The corn went in on schedule, and the kitchen garden was seeded, and the pasture grass came up lush enough to put the 2 horses out to graze rather than feeding hay, which saved a meaningful amount. On an evening in the 2nd week of May, they walked the fence line of the property after supper, which had become something of a habit, a daily accounting of the farm, and they stopped at the eastern edge where the creek bent and the light was going down amber and deep, and the sound of the water was pleasant, and the smell of the grass was that particular sweet green smell that Kansas managed in May before the summer came in and baked everything to gold. "I have been thinking," Harlan said. "About what?" He looked at the creek for a moment and then at her. "About the fact that I want to stay here permanently," he said. "Not on the terms we have now, which are decent terms, honest terms, but I want—" He stopped and started again in a way that was so uncharacteristic of his usual precision that she felt herself go very still. "I want to marry you, Delia, if you will have me. Not for the farm or for any practical consideration, though I know it would be practical and I know that matters, but because I have been on this earth 30 years, and I have not once in those 30 years wanted to stop moving until now. Until you." The creek went on making its sound, and the sky went on going amber, and she stood beside him and felt the whole enormous weight of the last year, the grief and the fear, and the shame of having to nail a note to a church door because she had no other options, and the way it had led her here, to this man with his direct face and his careful hands and his 8 years of looking for something. "I will have you," she said. I will absolutely have you." He put his arms around her, and she put hers around him, and they stood at the edge of the creek in the May evening. And she thought she had never been so glad of anything in her life as she was of having had the stubbornness to nail that note to the church door instead of simply giving up. They were married on a Saturday in June at the First Methodist Church of Caldwell, the same church whose door Delia had pinned her desperate note to 4 months before. And she thought about that note as she stood at the door of the church in the only good dress she owned. And she thought it was the strangest and most fortunate thing, that asking for the bare minimum had led her to this. The Reverend performed the ceremony with the efficient warmth of a man who knew his congregation well, and Cora Finch wept, which was unnecessary but not unwelcome. And Harlan stood at the front of the church in a new shirt that Delia had quietly arranged to have sent from the dry goods store, and he looked at her when she came down the aisle with an expression that she decided she would like to be looked at with for the rest of her life. The town of Caldwell had its own opinion about the matter, as it always did about everything, and some of those opinions were kind and some were curious, and some were of the variety that small western towns always generated about women who conducted their affairs with too much independence. Delia had long since decided that the opinions of Caldwell were not her primary concern. The summer was hard work, as summers always were. The corn grew well, and the garden produced generously, and they put up what they could for the winter, and Harlan proved to be a better hand at preserving than she had expected, having picked up the knowledge at some point in his drifting years from a woman in Colorado who had apparently been very thorough in the education she provided boarders. Abel Marsh did not disappear from their lives entirely, but he receded. The renegotiated debt payments were made on time, every time, which Delia was determined about with a thoroughness that bordered on the militant. And as the months passed and the payments were met, and the property remained intact, and the legal situation remained resolved, Marsh's interest in the Hale farm faded in the way that predatory interest fades when it finds another weakness somewhere else to attend to. She did not wish him well exactly, but she did not waste energy on him either. She had better things to do with her energy. What she did with her energy was build a life with Harlan Warren, and she found that this was the kind of work that did not tire her even when it was demanding, the kind that replenished itself as it went. He was a better farmer than he had claimed to be that first morning, and a better man in all the ways that proximity revealed, the patience and the humor and the constancy of him, the way he woke in the night when the weather changed and went to check on the animals without making a production of it, the way he listened when she talked about Thomas with the particular complex grief that is not uncomplicated even when the marriage was not uncomplicated, the way he never asked her to feel differently about anything than she felt. In October, when the harvest was in and the first cold came rolling down off the prairie, she told him she was expecting a child. He went very still. She watched his face and saw something move through it that she could not name at first, and then she named it joy, a very large and somewhat overwhelming joy that he was working to contain to a manageable size and not quite succeeding. "A child," he said. "A child," she confirmed. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her with a careful tenderness that made her close her eyes, and he said into her hair, "A child," a third time, as if he was learning the word, and she laughed against his shoulder and said, "Yes, Harlan, that is what I said." The winter was cold but not cruel, and they managed it well, the farm well provisioned, the house warmer than it had been in years because Harlan had spent most of September adding insulation to the walls in ways she had not previously thought possible with the materials available to them. She was not good at being pregnant in the sense of being willing to slow down or be careful, and he was not good at watching her carry heavy things without trying to take them from her, and they negotiated this ongoing tension with the humor that had become one of the reliable textures of their life together. She woke him once at 2 in the morning because she could not sleep and she wanted to talk, and he woke with the immediate alertness of someone who had come to understand that 2 in the morning wakefulness deserved a response. And they lay in the dark talking about the farm and the future and about names. And she said she liked the name James if it was a boy. And he was quiet for a moment, and then said that James had been his father's name. And the silence that followed was warm and full rather than empty. James Warren was born on a morning in late April of 1879, attended by the local midwife Mrs. Aldridge, who was capable and matter-of-fact, and who handed the baby to Harlan afterward with the no-nonsense efficiency of a woman who had done this many times, and knew that the fastest way to bring a grown man to his knees was to put a newborn in his arms. It worked. Delia watched from the bed, exhausted and aching and more purely glad than she had capacity to express, as Harlan held his son with the very careful attention of a man handling something infinitely precious. And the expression on his face was the same one he had worn at the creek the evening he asked her to marry him. That expression of having finally arrived somewhere that the 8 years of movement had been pointing toward all along. James was a healthy, demanding, red-faced creature who had opinions about nearly everything from the first hours of his life, and who grew quickly and well through that spring and summer. And Delia thought more than once that she could trace certain qualities directly to each of his parents. The stubbornness from her, certainly, and the careful watchfulness from Harlan, and the particular loudness of his objections from some shared combination of both of them. The debt to Marsh was paid in full in August of 1879, 16 months after the renegotiated terms were signed, 2 months ahead of schedule, which Delia had made a personal point of achieving because she had her mother's thorough dislike of being beholden to anyone, but especially to Abel Marsh. She made the final payment herself in cash, at Marsh's office in Caldwell, with Harlan waiting outside with the horses and James in the saddlebag carrier. Harlan had constructed from leather and wood, and she put the cash on Marsh's desk and watched him count it, and received the paid-in-full document with the even expression of a woman who has exactly the face she intends to have. Marsh looked at her across the desk and said, "You are a persistent woman, Mrs. Warren." "I prefer to think of myself as accurate," she said. She walked out of his office into the bright August morning, and Harlan was there with the horses and their son, and she took the paid document out and showed it to him, and he read it and looked at her, and she saw in his face everything she felt herself, the relief and the satisfaction and the sense of something finally, genuinely finished. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. James made a sound from his carrier that they had come to understand as enthusiasm, and they both looked at him and then at each other, and she reached up and he leaned down and they kissed in the street in Caldwell, Kansas, in the year 1879, which was not entirely common behavior in the street, and earned them at least 2 raised eyebrows from passers-by, which they both ignored entirely. The farm grew in the years that followed. They added a better barn in 1880 using timber they purchased with the first genuinely profitable harvest, and in 1881 they negotiated the purchase of an additional 10 acres to the north from a farmer named Prout who was moving to Denver, which extended the property in a direction that gave them better access to the road. The kitchen garden Harlan had argued for in that first spring became a significant source of supplementary income, as Delia began selling produce to 2 of the Caldwell merchants, a small but steady income that she managed with the same careful precision she brought to everything financial. Cora Finch remained their closest neighbor, and came to dinner often enough that she became in practical terms an extension of the household, particularly useful in the intervals when Delia was occupied elsewhere. And Cora and Harlan developed a friendship based primarily on the shared experience of finding Delia's certainty about things both formidable and extremely impressive, and occasionally exasperating in the way that admirable things can be exasperating. Harlan wrote letters home to an aunt in Independence, the only family he had left, and in the spring of 1881 the aunt came to visit, a small, sharp woman named Clara who looked at the farm and looked at Delia and looked at James, who was almost 2 and had recently developed the ability to run faster than seemed strictly necessary, and said to Harlan on the second day, "She is remarkable, your wife," in a tone that was both observation and question. "Yes," Harlan said simply. "She is. You seem happy," Clara said, and she sounded as though she had been waiting to be able to say this for a long time. "I am," he said. "I have been looking for something for 8 years, and it turned out to be in Kansas." Clara looked at him with the expression of a woman who has loved someone through 8 years of looking for something and is glad they found it, and she said nothing more on the subject, which was its own kind of complete sentence. Delia found Clara at the kitchen table on the last evening of her visit, and they talked over coffee in the way women talk when they are both direct people who have decided to dispense with unnecessary formality. And Clara told her things about Harlan's boyhood, and about his father the judge, and about the war years. The way he had come back from it changed in ways that were not always visible but were always present. The way he had spent years after it unable to find solid footing anywhere. Not because of any failure of character, but because something in him was still looking for the place where the ground felt real. "He found it here," Clara said, looking at the lamp with the quality of someone making a final assessment. "With you." Delia thought about the note on the church door, and about desperation, and about what it was possible to find when you asked for the very minimum and meant it. "We found it together," she said. The second child came in the winter of 1882, a December baby who arrived in a snowstorm with the enthusiasm of someone determined to be memorable, and they named her Iris, which had been Harlan's mother's name, a fact he mentioned with the careful quietness of a man who carries some things gently. Iris was from the first day the opposite of James in temperament, quieter and more watchful, with Harlan's particular quality of taking in everything before deciding what she thought about it. And James was besotted with her from the beginning in the way that older siblings sometimes are when they get the sibling they wanted. James would take Iris by the hand at every opportunity and lead her around the farm, narrating everything to her in the serious tones of a child, who has decided that the world is endlessly interesting and she should know about all of it. And Harlan and Delia would watch this from whatever they were doing nearby with the particular satisfaction that is its own complete emotion, too large to name and too ordinary to require naming. The farm in 1883 was a different thing than it had been in 1878. It was larger, better ordered, more productive, the fences straight and the buildings sound, and the soil worked with 5 years of consistent attention and care. The debt was gone, and there was a small but real accumulation in the account with Hollister's bank, which Delia found deeply satisfying in a way that she was not embarrassed about, because she had been told so many times that a woman alone could not manage, and she had decided that managing, genuinely and thoroughly managing, was its own form of response to everyone who had ever said that. She was not alone, of course. She had been alone for 6 months in 1878, and it had been the worst 6 months of her life, and she would not have wished them on anyone. But she also understood that they had made her, in certain ways, into the person who had the clarity to nail that note to the church door, instead of simply accepting whatever was offered her. And the note had brought her Harlan, and Harlan had brought her everything that came after. And she had come to think that sometimes the thing that feels like the end of everything is actually the end of one thing and the beginning of something else entirely. On a Sunday evening in September of 1883, which was one of those Kansas evenings that seems to contain the whole of summer in its light, amber and warm and impossibly clear, Delia and Harlan sat on the porch after supper, James playing in the yard with a hoop. He had rolled approximately 900 miles that day, and Iris asleep inside, having decided an hour earlier that she was done with the day and had gone to bed with great decisiveness, and the farm lay around them in the evening quiet. "What are you thinking about?" Harlan asked. She was quiet for a moment. "The note," she said. He looked at her. "The note on the church door." "Yes." She watched James conduct elaborate negotiations with the hoop. "I think about it sometimes, about what it cost me to write it. I was so ashamed, of the whole of it, of Thomas and the debt and the fact that I needed help and had to ask for it on a piece of paper nailed to a public door." She paused. "I do not feel that way anymore. The shame went somewhere." "Where did it go?" he asked. She thought about it. "I think it became something else," she said. "Something I do not have a good word for. Not pride exactly. Just I know who I am. I know what I did and what it cost and what it led to. I do not need to be ashamed of any of it." He was quiet beside her for a moment, and she felt his hand move to cover hers on the arm of the chair. "I read that note in the doorway of the church at 7 in the morning on a Thursday," he said. "I had been in Caldwell for 3 days and I was about to leave. I had spoken to 2 farmers about seasonal work and both of them had been discouraging, and I was thinking I would try Wichita instead." She looked at him. She had not known this part. "I almost did not read it," he said. "I was walking past the church door, and it caught my eye because it was an odd thing, a handwritten note pinned there like a public notice. And I read it, and I stood there in the doorway for a while, and I thought about all the reasons it was probably not my concern." He paused. "And then I thought about your word, honest, just the one word, asking for one honest man. And I thought, well, I am at least honest. I cannot claim much else of particular distinction, but I am at least that." She looked at him, and something moved through her so completely that she had to look away for a moment. At the yard where James was winning his argument with the hoop, at the fields going gold in the evening light, at the farm that was hers and his, and a place that meant something real. "You were not only that," she said. "I did not know it yet," he said. She turned her hand over and held his properly, the way she had held it the first time at the kitchen garden gate, and the evening went on being beautiful around them. The light and the wind and the sound of James's occasional announcement of victory to no one in particular. 5 years of mornings had changed them both, deepened them in the way that good things do when they are tended. And she looked at him, at the fine lines that were beginning at the corners of his eyes from years of outdoor work and squinting into the Kansas sun, at the particular quality of stillness in him that had been the first thing she noticed, and was still the thing she most relied on. And she thought about all the ordinary, extraordinary days that had been her life with this man. The arguments and the laughter and the hard work, and the children and the moments in kitchens and fields, and at creek sides where the world had felt entirely right, and she thought that she had asked for so little, just one honest man, and had received so very much more than she had known to ask for. "I love you," she said, because it was the truest sentence she knew, and she had never grown tired of saying it. He looked at her with that slow smile, the one she had first seen at her kitchen table over cornbread, the one she fully expected to go on seeing for the rest of her life. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since you stood in that field with a hoe and looked at me like you were deciding whether I was worth the trouble of the gate." "You were worth the gate," she said. "I tried to be," he said. James appeared at the porch steps, triumphant with the hoop, and presented himself for supper in the highly optimistic state of a 5-year-old, who has had an excellent afternoon and sees no reason why the evening should not be equally excellent. And Delia looked at her son and at her husband and at her farm in the September light, and she thought this was the thing. This was worth every hard thing and every frightened night and every nail driven into a church door with shaking hands. This ordinary particular life, built from honesty and stubbornness, and the willingness to ask for what she needed and not settle for anything less. She stood up and took James's hand and brought him inside for supper, and Harlan followed, and the door closed behind them on the evening, and the lamp came on in the kitchen window, warm and steady in the approaching dark, visible from the road the way a light is when someone has made a home of a place and means to keep it. The farm would stand for many years after that, and the debt would remain paid, and the children would grow, and the crops would come in year by year, and the fence lines would hold. And in the mornings, for as many mornings as they were given, Delia and Harlan Warren would stand in the kitchen of their house on the Chicaskia Road and share a cup of strong coffee and watch the dawn come up over the Kansas plain. And that would be the whole of what was required. And it would be more than enough. More than enough, and exactly right and complete.